All right. Well, it's 1:02, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce today Jennifer Bartlett, whose presentation will start momentarily. Jennifer is the oral history librarian at the University of Kentucky. Jennifer, if you'd like to expound on that introduction and then hop to it, feel free to go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jen Bartlett. I'm an oral history librarian here at the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. And I'm really happy to be talking to you all about, some of the work I do with oral history and, how we can perhaps use oral history more in our general information literacy instruction. So what I do mostly these days is teach students how to do oral history, whether it's projects that they're recording or, working with the materials themselves. But um, lately I've been thinking about, how can we use these materials in general information literacy instructions and sort of expand our repertoire, if you will, by using these materials. Oral histories are sometimes overlooked special collections and primary materials, but they are incredibly powerful narratives that can greatly personalize historical events and can give, added context to our students. They can highlight people who have been traditionally marginalized, thus offering valuable perspectives. And so we can use oral histories as artifacts and as part of our practice as a key component of our pedagogy. So today, what I'd like to talk about is just do a quick definition of oral history and what we mean when we say oral history, and talk about four different areas of instruction in which we can possibly use oral histories on some level. I have some practical examples and some ideas for incorporating oral histories into library instruction. I'll share some resources and strategies for finding oral histories, which is not always as easy, perhaps, as it sounds. And finally, I have a little bit of a call to action, maybe, how we might think about using oral histories as a tool for ongoing analysis and improvement of our library instruction programs. So I do have one caveat as I was putting together my presentation for you all. I thought a question that you might be thinking about throughout is, wait, I only have 50 minutes typically in an information literacy session, if that, and I'm lucky to get that. How am I supposed to take this additional material, these oral histories, and incorporate it into a session that is already packed? And when the instructor has a very definite idea of what needs to happen in this session. And, truly, it's that's a legitimate, concern and something I think we all deal with. But, even if, you just, keep in mind that oral histories are there and they might fit for a particular class or they might not, or you could, insert an oral history as needed, but it doesn't have to take over the whole session. So it's just one more tool, that we can, think about using as we plan classes for our students. So, what I'd like to talk about first then is what is oral history. Let's see if, oh, there we go, my slideshow. Current slide. My slides are stuck. Hold on. There we go. Everybody should see the what is oral history slide with Steve Zahn at the very top. So, what is oral history? It's both a field of study and a method of historical documentation. Oral histories are based on recording, preserving, and interpreting firsthand testimonies of people who have experienced or observed past events. And so, basically, it involves interviewing people to capture their own personal recollections and stories and perspectives, which may not be documented in actual written records. And so these interviews are typically recorded on audio or video. Since pandemic, there's been a lot more Zoom oral histories recorded, and then often they're transcribed for use in research and education. And of course, they're archived through centers, such as the Nunn Center. So, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between oral history and journalism and news, because many of us, of course, use, news stories in our work. And so the aspects of oral history and journalism, while there is some overlap, are somewhat different. So the purpose of oral history is to preserve personal recollections and experiences for historical purposes, where journalism, news stories, seeks to provide more timely information and news to the public, often with that emphasis on current events. The approach with oral histories, they are typically very, lengthy, in-depth interviews of maybe an hour or more. There can be a series of oral histories with one person, and that allows individuals to share their stories in their own words. Whereas with journalism, it involves more reporting on events and issues and topics with a focus on accuracy and objectivity and timeliness, and will often pull in other sources. Um, Oral history tends to embrace subjectivity. It values personal perspectives and memories, even if they're influenced by something that happened years ago, influenced by the passage of time, and of course, personal bias, which we all have. Whereas news stories, at their best, strive to achieve some sort of objectivity and balance and a fair and accurate representation of events. And both have a place, both those subjective narratives and also those objective news stories. And then, of course, a temporal focus. So oral histories often look back at past events and experiences, and journalism primarily focuses on current events and recent developments. So as we developed as we develop our information literacy sessions, it's good to keep those differences in mind. So just to talk a little bit about the oral history process, and I think regardless of what oral history um, uh, um, institution it is, what department it is, what institution that it operates out of, there are, 5 basic steps to the oral history process. The first being project planning. Someone comes to the oral historian with some sort of topic, some research project. They want to do some background research on this topic. They have some interviewees that they're thinking about talking to. This is often for a book or a dissertation or some kind of community process. Sometimes it involves doing an IRB, sometimes not. But the project is planned as far as timeline and budget and personnel and so on. It can be a very small community project. It can be a larger research project with a lot of staff and funded with a grant. After the planning, there's, the interviewing phase, which involves recording conversations with your interviewees for doing the audio or video. You can travel to the person's, site. People can come to campus or come to that, particular library, or they can do interviews via Zoom. And then they're archived, and we accession interviews into the archive with appropriate documentation, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, so that a permanent record is created of the oral histories. There are a lot of projects out there that are not necessarily archived in a real archive. A lot of times with community groups or personal family oral history projects, sometimes they're, sitting on a, flash drive somewhere or sitting on a Google Drive somewhere. That's not the kind of thing we're talking about here. We're talking about oral histories that are actually archived in a permanent archive. After that accessioning process, ideally, the interview will be indexed, which basically means some kind of finding aid will be created, some kind of index table of contents for the interview so that you can find information in it. And often the interviews will be transcribed. And that's becoming much more of a thing now that we have automatic speech recognition systems, often integrated with AI technology, so that your transcriptions just get better and better and better, regardless of the quality of your audio or video. So when we have these oral histories in place and they're archived and we have some, sort of index and some sort of finding aid, then it's then that we can profitably use them for what we're doing in our classes. So I've pulled out basically 4 different ways that we might think about integrating oral history into our information literacy practice, and basically 4 categories: oral histories as an introduction to primary sources, oral histories to help us do background research for projects, oral histories as a way to demonstrate intellectual property issues, and then oral histories as a tool for actual knowledge creation. And I'll do a summary of each one of these possible areas, and then provide some examples and some food for thought on these. So the first one is probably the most obvious, using oral histories as primary sources, because that's indeed what they are. And there are literally thousands of oral histories out there that people can use as primary resources for their work. And as with other primary sources, oral histories have certain characteristics that students need to be aware of, as opposed to what they might, be used to, the secondary resources such as journal articles and newspaper articles and so on. And some of those, of course, are the originality aspect of this material, that oral histories are original, unfiltered, unedited materials that have not been interpreted by others. And so we can look at them, as with other primary source material, as the raw material of history. They're also an artifact of direct evidence. So they provide firsthand testimony of a historical period, an event, or phenomenon. They're recorded, if not at the time and place of origin, it records memories of people who were there at that time, at that place, by people who directly experienced those events or those conditions that are being documented in this work. As I mentioned before, there's a heavy element of subjectivity to this, which is actually a good thing for students to be aware of. That these, primary source oral histories will contain personal viewpoints and biases and interpretations of their creators, which does provide insight into their own motivations and their own experiences. And also, it's important for students to realize that the interviewer has their own bias and their own um, reason for doing an interview. There might be certain questions that they ask, leading an interviewee into answering a certain way that they do. So these conversations are one of the things that make oral histories a little bit unique, because you typically have two people involved in the conversation. So a useful thing to be thinking about when you're listening to or watching an oral history is, okay, the focus is on the interviewee, on the subject of this interview, but what role does the interviewer have to play in creating this oral history, and how does it affect the way the material is being presented? So definitely something to think about and perhaps discuss. So I think the unique and authentic nature of oral histories make them a really unique resource, a really valuable resource for us to consider as we're doing this work. So just
Oh
one
my God.
example
What?
one
Like
example
what?
of how we can use oral history as a very, very short exercise, perhaps in a class, which is a little bit different. And I have done this in classes before. Is I mentioned that you've got the actual interview, audio or video, whatever it is, but then you will often have a transcript. Now, with most primary source materials, you really just have the physical material. You have the newspaper, the photograph, the archival document, and so it's there in print, usually in front of you. But with the oral history, you actually have two artifacts, right? You've got the actual interview, and then you've got the transcript. So what you can do is you can choose a relevant oral history interview from whatever repository that you're using, and you want something that has both the audio, video, and the transcript available, and you can excerpt a part of it for the students in your class and have them compare that written transcript to the interview, so they can follow along with a short 1 or 2 minute segment. And so questions for them to ask themselves is, okay, well, do these two versions of this interview match? If not, what is different? Did they learn anything from listening to the audio or watching the video that they could not have understood from just the transcript? When they're listening to the person's voice, or watching their face and watching emotions go across their face, and does that add an additional level of meaning to this text? If there are pauses, or a rise in volume, or a decrease in volume, or some kind of emotion, what does that mean? What kind of additional information does that give to the transcript itself? And so it can really be a very compelling experience that when you read something and then you watch the interview itself, sometimes the meanings can be completely different. And the end goal, or one of the end goals for an exercise like this, is to emphasize to students that it's important not to take documents at face value, that there's a story, there are motives behind all these sources, and using oral history in this regard just sort of gives us a very, very obvious example of something like that. So, along those lines, that sort of dynamic came into play with a project that we did here at UK with the School of Interiors and the College of Design. They just celebrated the 50th anniversary, and we were working with an instructor who was teaching an undergraduate level history and theory of design class, ID 162. And this began in spring of 2021 with the recording and indexing of oral histories as part of this anniversary project. And so these undergraduate students would interview two alumni, uh, an alumni who had graduated within maybe the past 5 years, an alumni who had graduated like 10 or more years ago. And then they would compare those two. And so they would, talk to the people, and then we would archive them. And then we hadn't indexed them at that point, but they would listen to the interviews and sort of compare and see, well, how are these texts different, and how are the experiences different? And what does this person has this have to say as opposed to the other person? And so we developed this corpus of interviews that we could then use for subsequent classes. So in 2022, we had another group of students for the same class do some interviews, but then they indexed interviews that had been recorded with the 2021 students. And so you see an example of that on the screen. This was one of the earlier interviews that we did in April of 2021. And we see the Zoom interview that was done with one of the original students. But then on the left-hand side of your screen, we see some indexing that was done in 2022, where the interview would be divided into segments, sort of chapters, if you will, for a 45-minute interview. So you have a five-minute chapter, maybe. And so there would be a title that the student would assign, and then subjects. So the students would look at the particular segment and say, okay, we do some training on what subject headings are. And then so here you need to assign some subject headings. And then we talk about subjects as opposed to keywords. So what's the difference, and how does the interplay between subjects and keywords help you access material in this interview? So basically, they're classifying information. They're pulling out information from this original artifact that one of the earlier students did to help with access. And so that's a project that's continuing now. And actually, it's one of our more successful ones. And I will say that it started small in 2021, but we really developed a great relationship with the instructor in design who spearheaded this project. And in spring of this year, spring 2024, he put together what he called a library infusion project for his ID 162 class. And basically that consisted of 4 librarians instead of just me coming in and talking to his class over the course of the semester. So we had our design librarian come in and talk about basic resources having to do with architecture and design and interiors, and that worked its way into a case study project. And then our affordable course content librarian came in and talked about open access materials and how that could be brought into play with their project. Our special collections education archivist was able to talk about primary source materials that could be useful to them as they work towards their semester-long project. And then I came in again to continue the oral history project with the indexing and the classification and more interviews. So it was really just a great example, and I can't say enough about the instructor who we worked with over in interiors, who was great and just gave us so much access to his students, which is not always the case, as we know. Our second area of using oral histories is, of course, in background research. And so we know that primary source materials can be incredibly valuable when students are doing research work, as they offer those unique perspectives and firsthand accounts that are generally perhaps not available in secondary sources. And these sources are often things that students are not aware of, especially our undergraduate students. So they provide the contextual understanding and supporting evidence for materials that the students have already collected. And they tend to, provide that human element to historical events, and can provide very diverse perspectives. Um, in the case of oral histories in particular, with that material, since a lot of it is not published already, it does tend to bring up, new questions, perhaps things that have not been considered already. And filling gaps in the record is also, I think, a particular strength of oral history material, especially for underrepresented or marginalized groups whose experiences may not currently be well documented in written sources. So it provides that voice that is, very, very much needed in a lot of topics, and perhaps is not there in the secondary literature. But one example that I did think about, that perhaps some of you have run into on your campuses and your locations as well, is when you get a research topic. And this happens all the time with freshmen and sophomores here at UK in our comp and com classes, where an instructor will ask them to explore a community issue. So we need to explore an issue at UK or in Lexington, or in the area, and it has to be a hyper localized issue. So something about local government, or campus government, or a campus issue. And we're asked to help students find secondary resource materials about these things. And other than the campus newspaper, like parking, for example, comes up all the time. So students need to write some kind of pro con exercise about parking, campus parking. It's like, okay, well, we all know that's a perennial issue pretty much everywhere, but where are we going to find information about that? And so there's that. There's, campus activism, perhaps, or food insecurity, whatever it happens to be. Going into local oral histories in your local archives can sometimes provide really great information for questions just like this, because it could be that someone sometime did some kind of project for a paper or their department or whatever, dealing with parking or dealing with food insecurity or Greek life or whatever it happens to be. And those are amazing primary source documents that you can add to your repertoire to introduce students to. So that's something that, shouldn't be overlooked when you're, involved in assignments like this, that this can really be a good resource for your students to look at. Here's one example that I wanted to, talk about, because I just think it illustrates this whole oral history being part of the research process just so incredibly well. And this particular interview is not from UK's collections. This is from Berea. Berea has an amazing collection of oral histories, and I think they've done a terrific job at organizing their website in such a way that they're very easy to find. And so I go to Berea's website all the time for oral histories to use for students. And so they do have this great project called Gathering the Stories of Appalachian Foodways. And it's these are with interviews. It took place from 2012 to 2016. And these interviews were with individuals born and raised in West Virginia, and also in Estill and Madison counties. And the purpose was to talk about just, food. How did food and, gardening and cooking and canning and preserving, how was that a part of their lives, growing up, and as they established their own households? And the entire project was recorded and transcribed by students, which I think makes it even more interesting. And so this is just one example of one of the interviews in that collection. This is Mrs. Addie Mae Bicknell. She was born in 1920, and she was a resident of Estill County. And this interview with her was recorded in May of 2012. And I've just excerpted just a little bit of the transcript from her interview, which I think is something like an hour and a half. And so she's talking about school when she was, going to school, and it was a one-room schoolhouse sort of situation. And she would walk, no school bus, right? So she would walk, and they were talking about lunches because we're talking about foodways. And so the interviewer says, "You didn't take a lunch bucket." No, because you were so close. You walked to school. And then she talks about a friend of hers, Kathleen. She took a bucket of lard. And it's like, lard, why? Well, it turns out that students would take their lunches to school in an empty bucket of lard because you had lard buckets. And so you took your lunch to school in a lard bucket, which I didn't know. And her friend mistakenly grabbed an actual bucket of lard one time and took it to school. She thought that was funny. And then they would talk about other things that people would bring in to eat, like biscuits in a jar of jam and ham biscuits. And they talked about trading food, swapping food. If you didn't like what you had brought, then you swapped with somebody else. And it's a really very short segment. It's under a minute, as you see. But that one segment can provide a lot of material for students to develop a research project. So we can take the obvious thing, look at the time where it is, 1920s, 1930s. Um, so we're talking about school lunches in a small rural school. So you're taking your lunch to school in a bucket. So a possible theme could be, well, what did lunches at school in rural areas look like during the Depression? What was available to students? That can segue into, okay, what's the background and history of schools in Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia during this time period? What were the conditions? What did they look like? You can also talk about home food production. You can talk about local stores, local grocery stores and commerce that can go into transportation systems. How did they get food to their community? What did the roads look like? Was there a train? Were most of their foodstuffs being produced on a farm or locally, or did they go to grocery stores? And then you can also talk about electricity in rural areas. So did the school have electricity so you could heat up your lunch? Probably not. But those are all areas that students could go off in just based on this one segment. And so I just did, a quick search using some of our databases and found a 1933 article, a contemporary article from the Journal of Home Economics, which was talking about community food support through classroom education in home ec, and how we can help families and we can help schools improve nutrition, especially during a difficult time during the Depression. And then also a book which some of you may be familiar with, by John and Ann Van Willigen, from 2006, called Food in Everyday Life on Kentucky Family Farms, 1920 to 1950. Very relevant. And you'll see there's a picture from this book of school children, outside this, building, and they're eating school lunch out of lard buckets in Breathitt County. So this is very, immediate for students because you see a picture of someone who actually lived through this, and then you see historical evidence from a secondary source talking about just this thing, and it makes the topic a lot more real. It's not just out there. It's not just a research project anymore. This is personal. There's real people who lived through these things, and here's one of them, and you can hear her voice talking about her lunch. So really, great project, I think. So from there, we'll talk about a slightly less fun topic, maybe, is learning about intellectual property issues. And like any other uh, resource, oral histories are subject to intellectual property rules, copyright. There are ethics concerns, there are legal considerations. And so with copyright, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but all participants in an oral history project need to sign agreements assigning intellectual property rights to an archive. Otherwise, we can't use it for researchers. So having that copyright is, incredibly, important. Or, putting, the material under a Creative Commons license. That's also something that needs to be thought about when people are putting together their oral history projects. So the same thing that people need to consider when they're writing a book or your dissertation or doing a video or whatever, the same types of rules apply to oral histories. Otherwise, we really can't use them. Ethics is also a major concern in oral histories, and we could do a whole session on ethics and privacy in oral histories. But basically, interviewers need to respect the rights of interviewees to refuse to discuss certain topics, and they can choose to be anonymous depending on the topic. They Oral histories may include information about the interviewee that is otherwise protected from disclosure. I know some older oral histories that we have here at the UK collection give the person's full name and their birthday and their address. Something we would never dream of doing now because it's so easy to take those pieces of information and get other information about people. So we have to be very careful as oral history archivists to make sure that privacy is protected. And so it's just one more thing that we need to consider when we're using this material. Legal considerations. Since oral histories are covered under copyright, people people generally do not get paid for doing oral histories, either the interviewer or the interviewee. That's not part of the professional practice. That would fall more in line with some, journalistic practices. So their copyright, their legal rights to that interview, although they can use that material since it's their interview, they need to assign those rights to archives such as museums or sound archives or local history collections or libraries. So, the reason, we bring this up is because it's important for students to know that this is protected material as well, just like anything else that you're going to use for, one of your research projects. So, um, talking about, the terms of use and also talking about proper citation style for oral histories is something that you can, perhaps, use in a class. So these recordings, they include that copyrightable material, copyrightable content. And in the front of this slide, you'll see what we use at UK libraries as a deed of gift. And other oral history archives are going to use the same kind of thing. And the deed of gift is signed when the interview takes place, and it is a legal document that assigns the ownership of that interview to the archive. Now, are we making money off of it? No, no, of course not. We are providing this to researchers, but we need to be able to do that. And so that's also reflected in our terms of use, which is at the top of the slide here, which is on our website. So, which says all rights to the interviews, including but not restricted to legal title, copyrights, and literary property rights, have been transferred to UK libraries. And so that really comes into play, especially when we're allowing producers to use these items that we do have to sign. The Nunn Center and other oral history archives as well need to protect those rights by having some kind of signed legal document with producers of video productions, for example. But under fair use, we don't do that. With students, of course, we just ask that they use a proper citation. And so over here on the right-hand side, I pulled this from the University of Louisville site, which has a really well spelled out, very, well-defined, simple way to cite oral histories in APA Chicago and MLA style, really, very, very simple. Basically, the interviewee's name, who was the interviewer, what was the project, the repository, and so on. And that would be, enough. So the important thing here is to reinforce to students that they can't just grab anything off the oral history site, perhaps like, they do off the web and just use it however they want to. These are protected materials, just like other things are as well. So here's an example of using oral histories in knowledge creation, which is our final focus. And we talked about this a little bit with previous project, but this is from this photo is Fawn Weaver. She's the CEO of Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey, and we did a project on Black women in bourbon. We have a lot of interviews on the bourbon industry in Kentucky here at the Nunn Center. And so what this was, we used these interviews in classes do profiles of particular people so that we could build it out into a website, a class-based website. And so that involved indexing the individual interviews, just like we did with the design students. And students did some background research on the business and industry of bourbon in Kentucky, and there's a lot of material out there on that. Training of people of distillers, people who go into the distilling industry, mentorship, challenges, all these things come into play. Using this interview as sort of the baseline for how we build out, or they build out a product and a digital project, in this case. So there are a number of interviews that students worked on, and it was basically one student per interview so that there could be some continuity, but they delved very deeply into this one interview, did the secondary research, and then developed material for a NOMECA site. A similar thing happened with this, the Out South project, and I'm showcasing one of my friends and colleagues here at UK, Raynette Jones, who was an interviewee in that project. And this website is another one that was worked on by both faculty and researchers and students as well. And you can see the different aspects of work that you can do based on this interview. So we have Raynette's interview, and she talks about her life as lesbian Black woman in Lexington, and issues as a professional, and things like that. And so we have subjects that are assigned to it. We have also interview keywords, which students can use to go in, and they can write a description. They can do some essays based on this topic, and so on, providing content to this website. Okay, so all this sounds great. I hope it sounds great at this point. Where do you find these things? So oral histories are surprisingly difficult to find sometimes, because in general, they are not cataloged individually in our online catalogs. They're created daily for the most part, and being able to catalog those on a timely basis and insert them into a catalog is a heavy lift. It is. So a lot of institutions, UK included, will have separate finding aids, separate catalogs for their oral histories. And so developing a list of those is useful. So here in Kentucky, these are just a few, but here's a few of the sites that you might visit. The Kentucky Historical Society. It is also home of the Kentucky Oral History Commission, which has a database, or had a database called Pass the Word, which has links to a lot of different oral histories. I think Pass the Word is being worked on right now, because I think right now it only has the KHS oral history interviews. But if you click on that link, you can get directly to their oral history collection, and it is quite deep. I've provided a link to Berea's oral histories. EKU has a nice one. And it's not just academics. Kenton County Public Library has a really nice collection of oral histories. There's the Louis B. Nunn Center, but there's many, many more. So, sometimes, the best thing to do, and I hate to say this, but is just do a Google search, and just go to Google, type in oral history, type in your subject. And sometimes that's the best way to find repositories for the particular subject that you're looking for. And I keep a running list of these repositories, because I'm always running up against, this new repository that I haven't seen that has a lot of cool oral histories in it, and I want to use it in my instruction and as examples. And so here are some national ones that you might look at as well. Archive Grid, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The DPLA, LC has a number of great oral histories, and then the Oral History Association has a lot of great resources that we use as well. So I know I've got just a few more minutes, but I do want to run this idea past you. This is sort of the call to action that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So I ran across this really interesting article from a librarian from New Mexico State University, in the Journal of Academic Librarianship. And they did their own oral history project recording librarians talking about their areas of practice. And it was initially for retiring librarians and library staff entering retirement. And certainly, I think some of us have collections like that as well. But it, occurred to me that I don't think we have an oral history collection for KLA. I don't think we have one, for LIRT. And, how cool would it be if we followed the example of some of our national institutions, like ALA has some archives based in Illinois. IFLA has an international oral history project interviewing librarians and library leaders internationally to put into an archive. And this is something that, we perhaps could consider as, a state association. How do we record our own stories and our own practice? And I included this clip from University of Missouri Libraries, who has some videos on YouTube. And they're not really oral histories. They're librarians talking about their work, but they're still, extremely interesting that they're talking about their different areas of practice and how they approach different problems. And so I think it's got some potential for us to think about as an association, and perhaps as a roundtable to be a really good way to disseminate information, and also perhaps use with library students as they're considering what careers that they want to go into. So I've listed a few resources for you to consider, just a few, especially the Oral History Association resources are particularly valuable, but others dealing with instruction and oral history and primary sources in general that have some really good tips and exercises for you to look at. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you found some of this interesting and had a few ideas perhaps pop up. And I think perhaps there might be time for questions.
Well, I have a question if nobody else does yet. How often do you get to actually go out and conduct interviews as part of your own research?
That's a great question. Yeah, so not as much time as I'd really like to. But yeah, no, part of my job is doing some original oral history work, and right now, I'm working on and one of the reasons I thought about this for KLA is I'm working on an oral history project documenting retired deans and directors from ASERL, the Association for Southeastern Research Libraries, and they did provide some funding for this. They wanted to archive it for their own anniversary back in 2014, I think. But now we're looking at continuing this project because now we have Zoom. Right. So after the pandemic, so many people were just doing interviews via Zoom because that's the only thing they could do. But now it's become a really valid way to, reach out to people really anywhere in the world. So now any oral history project can be an international oral history project. And this is really an easy technology to use for students, because students at this point, they know how to use Zoom. They know how to record, and they know how to work that technology. And so it's not a high bar for them to do an oral history project in class. But yeah, I do try to do it as have interviews as much as possible. And it's also important because when I talk to students about doing oral histories, it's helpful to have that practical experience and say, oh, you might run into this situation or that situation, and this is how you might consider handling that. So yeah, so short answer, I do interview, but not as much as I would like these days. Yeah. Thank you.
I love Esther's idea of having this set up at the KLA conference. Sorry. When we had our Bell Hooks conference, we had a recording area where people could stop in and share memories of Bell. And that was really easy to have students involved in. And that was a great idea of one of my new colleagues, Abby Houston. But I love that idea that you could just set up for folks who think that they wouldn't want to take on an entire oral history project, they could just, yeah, stop and contribute their own history briefly and then walk away. Somebody else can handle the aftermath. So that might be cool.
Hey, that's great.
Does anybody else have any questions? If not, you can be back here at 2 for Esther's KYVL, How to Do Research Revamp. Yeah, that was awesome, Jennifer. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Jennifer. It's great.
Hey, thanks everyone. Thank you.
Hey Amanda, could you set Esther as co-host?
I sure will. Let's see. Where are you, Esther? I know you're in here.
And do you want me to stop recording?
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah. All right, I can do.